Chicago architecture. It rocks. Okay.
I went to Chicago this summer and rode a bicycle, and now you're going to hear about it. I'm well aware that this isn't exactly on topic for a YouTube channel about trails, but just because I usually review trails in the woods doesn't mean I can't review trails and or bicycling and walking opportunities in a big city. Besides, there's nature here if you're willing to pay attention. Plus, there's this giant polished stainless steel bean. Anyhow, I did actually ride my bike on what looks like a trail if you squint hard enough. I also discovered that Chicago is a pretty awesome city. There are a lot of people in Chicago. Something like 10 million people live in the metro area, which the fine folks here refer to as Chicagoland. What other cities do you know of who just like they apply a unique name, not just to their city, but to the entire metro area? Pretty cool. Okay, I swear I'll get around to what this has to do with trails in a minute. Bear with me. And while you're bearing with me, this would be a good time to subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the link in the description that leads you to patreon.com/voiceovertrails, where you can sign up to support more informational content like this. Anyhow, I noticed something paradoxical about there being this many people, which is that I felt a lot less social anxiety walking around on crowded streets here than I do in my home city of Portland, Oregon, where I almost feel like I'm required to be walking with a friend or a dog or something in order for people not to stare at me like I'm a lonely sociopath. But it's not like that here. Instead, the fact that there is such an overwhelming mass of humanity gave me a very relaxing sense of anonymity. Like when you encounter someone on a street and you're the only other person there, you kind of have to make a decision whether you're going to interact with that person socially, but not when it's this crowded. When there are this many people around, you can do pretty much whatever you want. I spent 5 minutes pointing my camera at paper wasps doing their thing, and no one looked at me or even raised an eyebrow. I could point my camera pretty much anywhere at anything for any reason, and no one even seemed to acknowledge it. By the way, paper wasps are wildlife, so here's your nature right here in the middle of the third largest city in the country. Okay, so I walked around with my camera a lot. Now I understand what street photography is. The concept makes no sense in smaller cities where everybody looks at you if you've got a camera out, but here it makes sense. I could take pictures of people all day and they wouldn't care. Anyway, let's talk about my bike ride. The Lakefront Trail in Chicago spans almost the entire length of the east side of the city. At 18 miles long, this is like the mother of all multi-user pathways. This puts everything in Portland or Seattle to shame. 18 miles of almost completely flat multi-user path with separate pathways for walkers and bikers, all of it with a view of Lake Michigan. I'm officially jealous. I brought my helmet and my GoPro to Chicago, although I'll confess I wasn't exactly sure what I planned to do with either of them until I got here. I just knew I wanted them. Well, it turns out that there is a bike shop on the Lakefront Trail where I was able to rent a bike for a pretty reasonable price, and it was a pretty good bike too. So that's what I did. I walked to Third Coast Bicycles and I rented a bike. It was the 4th of July weekend and most of the city was north of me. That's where most of the people would be too, so I decided to head south from the bike shop. The giant freshwater inland sea to my left in this video is Lake Michigan, and that giant ocean-going ferry I just passed on my left was brought all the way up here from Newfoundland. Lake Michigan is 650 feet above sea level. Let that weirdness sink in for a minute. Ocean-sized vessels can travel up a series of locks in the St. Lawrence River and canals and stuff like that to a lake that's 650 feet above the ocean. Also to my left, you'll observe that there is a separate walking pathway along the lake. That's right, folks in Chicago decided they needed to be as extra as possible, and having just one multi-user pathway wasn't enough. So the fact that bikes and walkers each get separate pathways meant that combined with the overall flatness, because this is the Midwest after all, I was really able to just cruise way faster than I ever thought I would. I hate to admit this, but I didn't really realize until after I got home and someone pointed it out to me that this fountain, the one with the barfing murder horses that have fins for hind legs, is the same fountain they show in the opening sequence to Married with Children. As a millennial, I really should have picked up on that immediately, but I didn't. Anyway, it's a cool fountain. Barfing horses. Barfing mur horses. Barfing murder horses. Anyway, I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't rented a bike. A few miles further along, there's this cool spot kind of near the Field Museum where you can go under Michigan Avenue, which is kind of the main surface street through downtown Chicago, and then over the subway and just kind of poke around Grant Park. I guess one of the cool things about having a big city is you could also have big parks. As I was exploring, I found this cool monument. I guessed kind of that it must have something to do with the Great Migration, and it turned out, based on a nearby sign, that I was right. The monument was built to commemorate the Blues Trail, the migration path of large numbers of African Americans from Mississippi to Chicago during the early to mid 20th century. It's little gems like this that are the reason I love wandering around a city on a bike, because bicycles move at the perfect speed to discover a city. I forgot to bring a water bottle, and it was a 90-degree day, but that turned out not to be a problem because Chicago maintains their infrastructure. Every single drinking fountain I encountered along this path, and there are many, was in working order. I'm genuinely impressed, and I was well hydrated thanks to the civic infrastructure of the Windy City. As I wheeled back to the Lakefront Trail, I found that to my right was the Field Museum, which I kind of wish I'd taken the time to explore, but I only had 5 days, and so it was between this or the Art Institute. I chose the Art Institute, where I spent 4.5 hours inside the Art Institute, and I still don't think I saw it all. Anyway, these views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline are incredible. Honestly, I could have just sat on this lakeshore all day long, and I noticed that indeed a lot of people were just sitting next to the lake, next to their bikes. More about that lakeshore in a minute. The farther south I went, the sparser the population appeared to get as the crowds thinned out. I was also beginning to see a lot of prairie restoration projects happening along the lakeshore, which I thought was pretty cool, but not as cool as this herd of roller skaters I encountered. Apparently, they were part of a group called Lake Skate, and they were skating for some appreciable long distance along the pathway with music blasting, and I think this means Portland might need to up its game. Okay, Portland has Pedalpalooza and the Naked Bike Ride. Nothing could touch that. But I fear Chicago might be ahead of us on roller skating, although maybe that's not fair, because how do you compete with a flat city that has an 18.5-mile trail that's like beautifully maintained like this? There's nowhere in Portland you could roller skate for that long, or any West Coast city that I know of. Maybe Boise, although the Boise River Greenway is not very well maintained. Further along, there are a lot of really nice, pleasant little beaches interspersed along the lakefront. At first, I thought it was just an anomaly, like maybe there would be a beach, here and there, but no, actually, beaches are a serious thing along Lake Michigan, at least near Chicago they are. And this isn't like Oregon and Washington, where brave souls dare each other to enter 55-degree breakers in the ocean during the summer in triple-layer wetsuits. No, this is like full-on, just summer fun, family-friendly, people in bathing suits at the lifeguard present beaches, but with fresh water. These beaches are also intentional. The Midwest has a lot of sand, especially around Lake Michigan. So they've strategically placed jetties out into the lake to induce sand to kind of collect at all these beaches. But I noticed one thing was conspicuously absent along this entire lakefront trail. There were no homeless encampments. I don't know what Chicago is doing, but whatever they're doing it right. Maybe the harsh winter weather forces them to come up with a longer-term solution than just letting it happen. I don't know, but the multi-user paths are no longer usable in my city or pretty much any other West Coast cities because of all the tents set up in the pathway, open drug use, and human feces on the ground. But there was none of that here. The other thing I noticed was that in addition to functional drinking fountains, there are a lot of amenities provided by the city, such as these public showers and changing rooms located conveniently along the beach. There is no one living in the tents that you see set up in the grass to my left. This is just a public park. They're just here for the day, and they'll leave at the end of it. Because people who live in Chicago come on down here to hang out at the park along the lake. No big deal. They probably didn't even have to drive 2 hours to get here. Things appeared to be pretty orderly. Speaking of orderliness, I also noticed a very visible police presence. It felt like, at least down here on the path, the police were pretty laid back and sociable, but I don't know, I was a white dude on a bike. Nobody bothers us. But it is possible, though, that maybe having that uniformed presence around kind of helped keep things polite. So the more low-key, family-oriented fun happens kind of on the south side of the lakefront, by my observation. Now, keep in mind, I didn't ride my bike into the surface streets on the south side. I like everybody, I've heard all the terrible, scary things about the South Side. I don't even know what that means, right? I don't live in Chicago, so I don't know what street that horror supposedly starts on. And I'm not going to make social commentary about Chicago because that's not fair. I'm not qualified to do so, and I'm not here to dump on a city. I don't live here. So if you were about to say something catty about Chicago's social problems in the comments, don't. I mean, not unless you live in Chicago, right? If you don't live there, your opinion doesn't matter. So anyway, I kind of turned around at Oakwood Beach. I wasn't tracking on how flat this place is. So I was trying to keep the mileage lower because if I were riding in Portland, a 20-mile ride usually includes a few thousand feet of climbing. But I shouldn't have bothered. Everything was so flat that I was traveling at least twice as fast as I'm used to with half the amount of effort. I could have covered much more mileage if I'd bothered to bring a water bottle. So I headed back toward the bike shop and then decided to head north because I wanted to see what the more crowded party beaches looked like on the north side. I wanted to see the crowds. So the video you've been looking at for the past minute or so is me heading back north into the downtown area. Unsurprisingly, the pathway is much more crowded up here on the northern end, as this is where all the tourists like me are hanging out. I liked this stretch along the pathway. There were these long concrete steps along the waterfront. I love stuff like this that just exists in big cities. You can't just have amenities like this in smaller towns. It was so cool to see people just hanging out on these steps, chilling, some of them even swimming laps in the water. You know, if I lived in Chicago, I think this is where I'd want to hang out. It isn't all just quiet people sitting around though, because once you get farther north of the Chicago River, there's more of these folks out in their party boats. Like, I guess I'm calling them party boats because I didn't see them moving. They were just floating around and they were blasting music and I don't know, they were partying. It may not exactly be my scene, but it makes me happy when other people are having a good time. And it sure looked like the fine folks floating out of the marina were enjoying themselves. Farther north of the marina is the Oak Street Beach. It's just this little sandy beach right next to downtown Chicago. No big deal. This is what you'd classically call a beach with folks playing volleyball, physically attractive people hanging out in skimpy swim gear, and kids playing in what passes for waves. Then that beach gives way to my personal favorite, the concrete beach. This is a beach made out of concrete, hence the name. You know, if I had to spend time at a beach, this is how I'd like to do it. This is so much cleaner, so much more hygienic than sitting in sand. You know, sand is just coarse dirt, right? Anyway, the last beach I rode past was the North Avenue beach right next to Lincoln Park. This definitely had the most party-like atmosphere of all the beaches I saw, with more volleyball courts, some boat-shaped restaurant called Castaways, barefoot people wandering around shirtless, and jet ski rentals. That's right, jet ski rentals. There is an awfully brave business owner renting jet skis out to any idiot dumb enough to want to rent a jet ski. It rained the next day. I was gonna rent a jet ski. So I didn't get to, which means jet skis aren't cool because I didn't get to rent one. This is where I kind of got bored with the Lakefront Trail, so I crossed over into the city on Fullerton Avenue. There aren't really bike lanes on Fullerton, so that kind of pushed me and all the other idiot bikers onto the sidewalk for a while, but eventually the traffic does start slowing down here through what Google Maps tells me is the Mid-North District. It's just south of Park West. You know, neighborhood names mean like nothing to outsiders like me. Actually, you know, that's really a comment. That's a comment that's more directed at New Yorkers. They seem to think that outsiders know and or care about their geography. So good on you Chicagoites for not acting like that. Anyhow, I started heading south down Geneva Terrace, and even on this seemingly random side street, the excellence of Chicago's architecture really stands out, at least compared to the West Coast cities I'm familiar with. It's almost like every builder or architect or designer feels obligated to keep their work attractive and unique and distinctive in comparison to the buildings next to it. So the superlative architecture of downtown Chicago seems to be having a ripple effect throughout the city, at least the parts of it that I saw. Riding my bike on the side streets like this wasn't scary. Now, it could have been scary, but it wasn't. I don't know if the drivers here are accustomed to bikers occupying the traffic lane like I was doing here, but no one seemed alarmed, and honestly, I'd say drivers were giving me more deference and space than they generally do in Portland. Maybe they thought I was crazy and they just wanted to be as far away from me as possible. I don't know. Overall, though, these neighborhoods are lovely. I loved it. I mean, I'm sure it's not as pleasant in the winter. I know that, right? Chicago winters are legendary, but at least in early July, with leaves on all the trees and the nice lake breeze, the city is just gorgeous. It's so cool. After a few miles on Geneva, which turned into Larrabee Street, I turned left on North Avenue, then right on Mohawk Street. And hey, here's something you don't see in West Coast cities. The elevated train, or the L, as I'm told the locals call it, just passing right through a neighborhood. Obviously, I think this is a pretty neat structure. It's just, there it is, right? These elevated train tracks. But another thing I noticed is the rust all over pretty much everything that can rust. And that probably gives me a few clues about how bad the winter weather probably gets here. Seriously, there's like rusted rebar poking out of almost every freeway overpass. It's apparent the road salt and the fierce weather are just brutal on the built environment here. I suspect that probably the reason that streets and sidewalks and everything seem so generally well maintained is probably that the people of Chicago don't have a choice, right? They have to maintain it or else it crumbles. This piece of bike infrastructure where Clybourn meets Division was a standout for excellence. I loved the barrier between cars and bikes turning into the bike lane, the accommodation for pedestrian crossing. This is very much the kind of infrastructure that I'm used to interacting with. These major arterials cutting through the dense parts of the city are a bit treacherous, so anything that can be done to mitigate that is nice, especially considering what happened to me next when I almost got myself killed at this intersection with Orleans and Ontario Street, where the road it kind of turns into an expressway, right? It turns into an on-ramp to get onto the Kennedy Expressway. I didn't know that, so I was riding in the car lane like I'm used to doing in the city I'm from. Yeah, don't do that. Like, the problem was that the car lane goes straight onto the freeway, and I didn't know that. So then I was like frantically looking for an escape, and so I got over onto the traffic island, and some poor confused dude in his car almost hit me. It wasn't your fault. Sorry. Anyway, I had to spend a few minutes on the traffic island, kind of like watching the traffic patterns before I could figure out how to get myself out of that wire puzzle of an intersection. Now, it turns out that Chicago has a few more actual bike lanes downtown. Illinois Street has a nice one that'll take you all the way east to Navy Pier, which, now that I think about it, I did not bother to explore, so I guess I'll forever regret not seeing that tourist trap. Anyhow, the most important thing I learned about biking in downtown Chicago is just to avoid Michigan Avenue at all costs. A lot of the side streets are quiet and quite usable as well as visually interesting, but Michigan Avenue is an unholy hellscape of speeding and impatient frustration. It's like a freeway with stoplights passing through the middle of a major city amongst hordes of people on foot. It's just a recipe for conflict and frustration, and if you're on a bike, it's best to just stay away from it and let the cars and pedestrians battle amongst themselves. These electrically assisted pedicabs are everywhere and they're annoying. They take up a lot of space in the pathway and they're slow. And here's where I decided to end my bike ride by looking like a total idiot, as I put the hammer down to pass this pedicab and the person right behind it without realizing I was already almost to my destination. So then I had to frantically pull to the side of the path while slamming on the brakes right in front of the pedicab and the person I had just passed. And the person that I had just passed who was behind the pedicab was like, "What was that?" I'll tell you what that was. A total unintentional jerk move by an out-of-town tourist. That's what that was. That was me being stupid. I'm so sorry. That's all. Anyway, riding the Lakefront Trail was fun. So was pedaling through downtown Chicago. Chicago is awesome. Well, at least in the summer, it's awesome. You should visit, and when you do visit, you should bring your helmet and your chamois and set aside a day or two to rent a bike and ride around. Third Coast Cycles, they don't know who I am. This is not a sponsored endorsement, but they were awesome. Their bikes are super well maintained, and they rent them out at a pretty decent price, and they have high-end bikes for very reasonable prices, on top of which they will actually mount clipless pedals to the bike for you if you request that. So you can bring your clipless shoes. If you're not a biker, you don't need to know what that means. You can bring your clipless shoes. You don't need a mountain bike in this city, so don't even think. I know this is mostly a mountain biking channel. We all know that, but you don't need a mountain bike in this city. It's too flat, mostly paved. But anyway, they will have what you need, from high-end road bikes to just a touring around bike. With a flat terrain and extensive grid system, I could have easily spent a few more days just riding a bike around this town. I thoroughly enjoyed my time here, and I recommend it. This is a great summertime destination. Just make sure you bring, like any city, just make sure you bring a bike lock, right? Don't leave bikes unlocked. I'd like to take this moment to thank all of my Patreon supporters, especially my Low Me Goodness level sponsors, Andy Sewery, Charles Kim, Damon Corey, and Randy Relithford. I'd also like to thank my Hero Dirt level sponsors, earning their special mention at the end of this video: Bryce Ulrich, Dave PNW, Devin Young, Edward Lanton, Heather Von Valkenburg, Jason Moore, and Pedro Cantarini. If you'd like to breeze in and join these patrons of trail-related content, even if it's the occasional paved trail in a windy city next to a giant lake, navigate to patreon.com/voiceovertrails and become a sponsor. Now, get out there and go ride your bike.